be easy to tell of discovery, of archaeology finding a hidden history. But that would assume that somehow the heritage of freedom was erased, but it never was. Through the generations, people knew of a spirit that we today can refer to as the spirit of Angola. What I'll be doing instead is using archaeology to provide a concise history for the maroonage of Angola on the Manatee River. We'll look at the 1770s to 1821 and beyond. And we'll be retelling the story so that descendants still to come will know more details of what occurred in Southwest Florida 200 years ago. It's so easy around Sarasota, Manatee to assume that everything is recent, but there's a fascinating history that the National Park Service recognized in 2019, part of the Network to Freedom, which is otherwise commonly known as the Underground Railroad. Not the northern route, which is the most famous one, but the southern route of the Underground Railroad. And part of that route was by the Manatee Mineral Spring, what's now a capped spring in East Bradenton. There's ironies in this history. There was slavery, and then a place of freedom, and then when the United States took over Spanish Florida, slavery again, but then liberation again. And hopefully, by telling the story of what's under the surface, we can increase the liberation of all people. Looking at the area, it looks like just a pleasant field. But under that ground, for those who walk in the area beneath your feet, was a maroonage. This is a term that's used throughout the Spanish Caribbean for places where humans who escaped, people who escaped slavery lived, self-emancipated people. There's two types of maroonage. Those are individuals and larger permanent communities. Angola on the Manatee River, and that's where you see the blue in the background is the Manatee River, was a grand maroonage, an important chapter in the history of freedom. It was a long-standing project, lasting 15 years and still ongoing. It was difficult to understand a maroon community on the Manatee River. We had to ask over and over again, why were there maroons in Tampa Bay in the early 1800s? And what you'll see in this concise history is the work that came out of archaeology. There in the middle, I'm Uzi Baram, professor of anthropology at New College of Florida. Here are some of the people who worked on the excavations. And although the excavations were very much place-based, the history of Angola is about movement of freedom-seeking people. What we know grows out of historical archaeology, grows out of work on archives and excavations brought together. The settlement begins in the 1770s. It's part of an economic process that brings Cuban fisher folk, to the Florida Gulf Coast to create ranchos. They would come, fish the waters, and then bring them back to the major Spanish port city of Havana. They needed to trade, and they traded with people in the interior, people of African heritage we know of as Maroons. That small settlement grew because of battles across Florida. In 1816, the Battle of Prospect Bluff meant refugees came by sea and land to this growing maroonage. After the Battle of Suwannee in 1818, even more people came to the community, swelling up to more than 700. They found years of liberty. But in 1821, just as Florida was handed over from Spain to the United States, a slave raid destroys the community. But the story does not end. Because as people in motion, people who escaped enslavement or were born in freedom in Spanish Florida, who fought battles at Prospect Bluff and Suwannee and Angola, moved to the interior of Florida or through the Everglades to Cape Florida, now part of Miami, and on to the British Bahamas, where they were able to live in freedom to the present day. But even in Florida, the story doesn't end. 14 years later, some of the Maroons join in the Dade ambush. What triggers the Second Seminole War, a large-scale uprising by Native Americans and people of African heritage. We end up calling those people Black Seminoles, and they fight and fight for their freedom. And their story goes on to the present. To make sense of all this, we need some geographic and historical information. The key dates for Florida: 1513, when Ponce de Leon names La Florida. Spain rules lightly over the peninsula from 1513 to 1763, when international intrigues provide a 20-year span for the British. They return Florida to Spain after the American Revolution, and for several decades, Spain nearly rules Florida, really only having settlements at St. Augustine and Pensacola. In 1821, the territory goes to the United States. 1845, it becomes a state. For the Maroons, the key dates: 1893, 1733, 1814, 1816, 1818, 1821. I'll be using these dates to tell the story of freedom in motion, in Spanish, La Florida, for freedom-seeking people. We start by St. Augustine, at a place known as Fort Muse. Florida was a place of freedom. Charles II of Spain set a decree that anyone enslaved in the Anglo colonies, if they escaped to Spanish territory and accepted Catholicism and his rule, they would be free. And everyone wanted to be free. And so people escaped. By 1738, the population was large enough that a fort was created just north of St. Augustine. It only lasted 2 years until a British force attacked and destroyed it. It was rebuilt in 1752 and lasted 11 years before the British came. And these Black warriors, as they were known, either went with the Spanish to Havana or moved into the Florida interior. The British ruled for 20 years and then returned the territory to Spain. And during what's known as the Second Spanish period, we have more events. We don't know much about the people who were living in Spain during this period. The Spanish crown did not control it well. We do know there were people of African heritage, both those descended from Fort Muse and others who escaped enslavement to find their freedom in the swamps and hammocks of Florida. They didn't want to be counted. They didn't want to be known, but their numbers probably made up the majority of the population of Spanish Florida. But then the War of 1812 raged across North America, best known for what occurred in the Northeast, but also famously the Battle of New Orleans. As part of the intrigues of the War of 1812, the British built a fort on the Apalachicola River for Native Americans and people of African heritage in the fight against slavery. As the slide shows, the terminology that was used by the Americans was a bit archaic for me to repeat out loud right now. But it was a large-scale fort built with British engineering skills that brought hundreds of people to the Apalachicola River. This river today is known for its oysters and some sleepy towns. Then it was the major route for what's now Georgia and Alabama and its agricultural goods. The U.S. correctly saw this as a threat to the slave regime because this was the citadel of freedom. People flocked to it. In July 27, 1816, the U.S. Navy went into Spanish territory under orders of Andrew Jackson, the general who won the Battle of New Orleans. And the account states how awful it was. This is the American account. And I won't read it out loud because it's too painful to read what Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Lamont Clinch wrote. But at least 300 people were killed at the fort, a couple of hundred captured, but more escaped. Today, what's known as Negro Fort at Prospect Bluff, still known by those words, was seemingly forgotten. It's a park in an obscure state forest, but it's marked and memories remain of what occurred there more than 200 years ago. It was a place of freedom because Sir Edward Nichols promised it would be a place of freedom. We know what he had to say thanks to the scholarship of the historian Nate Millett. He made promises that ultimately were kept, but it took a couple of more chapters before we get to that promise being kept. We have a sense of what it looked like thanks to both U.S. military records and efforts to digitally reconstruct what was known as the British fort because of the British flag. It also had a red flag on it to show it was a military installation. It was gigantic. In the center was a magazine. That was the lucky shot that hit the magazine that blew up the fort and killed a couple of hundreds. But after that tragedy, people escaped to the Swanee River. Again, a major river that goes through Georgia and Florida. Andrew Jackson rightfully understood that survivors of Prospect Bluff could be organized against American forces, could help liberate people in enslavement just across the border. And so taking his Tennessee volunteers, he entered Spanish territory without permission and attacked the Swanee settlement. The U.S. military records indicate the Black warriors held them back and people escaped. We have a sense of what this looked like, again from U.S. military records, with Billy Bowleg's town being the main Seminole encampment, and then what's known as excuse the language, the little towns, really hamlets strewn on the south side of the Swanee River. Andrew's aide, James Gladson, wrote about Tampa Bay as the spot that the survivors came to, the area that we now know was just south of the Manatee River, where the Maroons could communicate with the Spanish and their British allies. We've looked across Tampa Bay and we found the evidence on the south side. We had very little to go on, but we were able to be successful after nearly a decade of archaeological research. And we found evidence for these Maroons. We have a sense of their daily life, what they grew, what they ate, how they lived. And we've been able to reconstruct what it may have looked like when the spring flowed to the Manatee River and people had their cabins and their fields. Because of that information from Swanee, it's likely that they lived in hamlets. What we excavated by the Manatee Mineral Spring was only one component of a much larger settlement. The 700 or so people were not congregated together. They were afraid, rightfully, of being captured. So they were spread over the area in small hamlets, growing their crops, tending to their horses and cows and pigs. They may have reached all the way down to where New College of Florida is today. But people did not forget about them. And in April of 1821, as a new paper count laid out, people planned a slave raid. They referred to Angola as Sarasota, one of the earliest mentions of that name in the historic record. And that slave raid captured 300, plundered their homes and fields. And then they went down further to Charlotte Harbor and terrorized the people of the West Coast. We know some of these people because of who was captured. And I can talk about Sarah or Manuel or Nancy or Mary or Valentine and William, Cato. These are people who were tremendously courageous, living in freedom. We can piece together some of the other people who are now known as Black Seminoles from the Second Seminole War. Abraham, one of the great leaders of Florida. John Horse, who escaped with Black Seminoles from Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, to Mexico. Luis Pacheco, who was part of the Dade ambush, and because he lived until 1892, was able to tell his story to newspaper reporters, and we have more of an inkling of some of the details of life during this era of terror. But some of those people who were captured, two in particular from this list we have, ended up in 1821 in the British Bahamas. Edward Nicolls promised them freedom in British lands. Some went into the interior after the destruction of Angola. Others went south through the Everglades to Cape Florida, and with the help of the British and Cuban fishermen, got to Andros Island in the Bahamas, the British Bahamas. And we see names, you can't really see in this slide clearly, but two names of people who were captured and then ran away after being captured before they got to Georgia are found on the same list. This is as good as history can provide, archives can provide in terms of information. The work is due to Ross and Howard, retired from the University of Central Florida now. We know of the hundreds who escaped to the Bahamas, where they and their descendants have lived in freedom ever since. This history was never lost. The people, the elders of Andros Island, Ms. Marshall, Reverend Newton, told of the ancestors having come from Florida. They knew some of the details. Reverend Newton produced some of the information in a 1968 book on the history of red bays. They wove, that's a beautiful basket made under the guidance of Ms. Marshall, and they knew of their ancestry, and they kept a sense of identity. When Ross and Howard wrote up our ethnographic work, the title of the book was The Black Seminoles of the Bahamas. That was their identity. We know of their original settlement. There's me squatting by the original well at Red Bays, and Ross and Howard, you see it pictured here, lays out the genealogy to the present day. Generation after generation told the story of freedom in Florida and the escape to the Bahamas. And we need to honor that heritage. And it isn't a simple endeavor. In 2018, Daphne Towns, pictured on the top left, who's from Andros Island, who's Black Seminole, whose ancestors were at Angola, brought descendants in a celebration known as Black to Angola to sing and eat and remember what was there. The first was in July 2018. The second was July 2019. COVID-19 prevented a festival in 2020, but the plan is to have annual festivals to celebrate the shared history of Bradenton and the Bahamas, to share this tremendously important heritage of freedom that was on the move and continues to be on the move and inspire people. More excavations with descendants have revealed even more information that will be shared and reshared so that we can think about how much courage people had in their flight for freedom, in their creation of a new way of life, of liberty. That's the continuing task. Will never be done. We're going to have to think about this maroonage over and over again, every generation telling it slightly differently. It's a saga of freedom, one that hopefully inspires, one that's part of a much larger history for Maroons, otherwise known as Black Seminoles, for the Seminole people who have invoked, but there's a much richer history to share. People known as Spanish Indians who weren't Seminoles, who accepted Catholicism and were living with the Cuban fishermen on the coast. It's an archaic term, but the British filibusters, Edward Nicolls and others, risked their lives to help in the fight for freedom. And then the Anglo-American pioneers, people who started coming in 1840s, and built on the land of these Maroons using their fields. All of this is a cosmopolitan past with tremendous amounts of complexities that help us understand the cross currents and the cost of freedom. Many contributed to this history, to sharing it in the 21st century. Some of the names are listed here. And to tell of freedom, to keep the spirit of Angola alive, it'll take even more people willing and able and caring enough to bring it forward, to continue to be inspired, to continue to wrestle with what it means to be free people. Thank you for listening to this concise history for Angola.